Welcome, everyone. We'll give it a couple of minutes just to let people join. It's nice to see the numbers kind of loading. Okay, well, thank you everyone for joining us today and on time. Welcome to the third annual What Do Canadians Think About Climate Change webinar. Over the next 75 minutes, we'll dive in and discuss the most recent public opinion research on climate change and energy transition in Canada. My name is Amber Bennett, and I am the Deputy Director of Re.Climate, and I'll be hosting the session today. I'm joining you from Calgary, which is situated in Treaty 7, the traditional territories of the Blackfoot Confederacy, which are the Siksika, the Kainai, the Piikani Nations, and the Tsuut'ina and Stoney Nakoda Nations and Métis Nation Region 3. These lands sustain me and sustain this work and my family, and I'm grateful to be here. We have people attending today from all across this land we call Canada. While we wait for others to join, I'll invite you to take a moment to introduce yourself and acknowledge where you call home. So this webinar is hosted by Re.Climate. We are Canada's new Centre for Climate Communications and Engagement based at Carleton University. We offer resources, training, strategy, research summaries, and we host strategic conversations. Sometimes we might feel alone in the work that we're doing, and now more than ever, but you're not alone. Today we have about 800 people who have registered for today's webinar, and I hope to see many of them today. So we do have people, thank you, Agnes. Agnes is kicking us off, and Cassandra. So we have people from one end of the country to the other, including the panelists and the people who are speaking and helping to make this happen today. And we have everyone from Indigenous leaders to grandparents, policymakers. We have communicators and people from all levels of government. We have scientists and researchers, including some of those whose work we'll be referencing today, and as well as educators, doctors, union leaders. So it really goes to show the broad interest in how climate change touches on many of our lives, all of our lives, and the work that we do. We also have funders, including McConnell Foundation, whose support, or without whose support, this would not have happened. We also have the Ivy Foundation and the Trottier Foundation, who support our work as well. I love seeing this. Thank you, everyone. Please continue to introduce yourself in the chat. It's really nice to meet old friends and to meet new people. So in terms of the overview, or what we'll be doing today, Re.Climate's work really is focused on supporting communicators. And there is so much excellent research that's happening across the country, and very few of us have time to comb through it all. And so we've tried to do that for you. And our goal today is to bring it together in one place, see what it says, what it means, what's missing, and offer some recommendations. We're grateful for the work that Dr. Eric Lachapelle at the University of Montreal and James Boothroyd at Eco-Analytics Research Institute for their long-time research program and for making their data public. We're also drawing on the work and the research firms and academic programs, in particular Positive Energy at the University of Ottawa, Abacus Data, the Angus Reid Institute, Eco-Analytics, Environics, Ipsos, Lakehead University, NANUS Research, the Pew Research Center Improved Strategies, and there may be more in there. You can see when we release the report after this. We'd also like to acknowledge that there are a number of NGOs in Canada that are making their research publicly available, including Clean Energy Canada, clean prosperity in the Sierra Club of Canada. So if you are a researcher from one of those organizations, I do encourage you to take a look at the Q&A. Sometimes we have questions that come up that are very specific to the work that you've done. So feel free to jump into the Q&A or into the webinar chat and answer those specific questions if they relate to your research. As well, if any of you who are here today have research that you'd like to share, please do in the webinar chat, and we'll compile that and include that in the post communications. So finally, and let's get started, we've got 3 amazing presenters today, including our report author, Chris Hatch. Chris currently works as a strategic consultant on energy and climate change. He is the former executive director for Canada's National Observer, where he writes the weekly newsletter Zero Carbon. Chris was previously the executive director of Rainforest Action Network and has a background in campaigns and strategic communications on climate, clean energy, human rights, and general environmental sanity. So thank you, Chris. Next, we have Dr. Valériane Champagne St-Arnaud. She is a professor in the marketing department of Laval University and specializes in social marketing applied to environmental issues. She is a scientific coordinator for the Baromètre de l'Action Climatique au Québec, a study conducted annually since 2019. And she's leading the groups de recherche sur la communication marketing climatique. She has an excellent understanding of what drives and hinders the Quebec population, and we're all excited to hear more about it. And then finally, joining us for the panel will be Cara Pike. She's recognized as a global pioneer in climate change communication and engagement. She is the founder and part-time executive director of both Re.Climate and Climate Access, nonprofits focused on building political and public support for climate solutions through learning networks for nonprofits, government leaders, resources, pilot projects that test new engagement approaches. So in terms of what will happen, Chris will share an overview of the key findings from 65 surveys published between 2022 and early 2023. Valériane will then share key findings from Quebec, and we'll have a discussion on the key findings and what it all means for communicators. Finally, we'll wrap up with audience questions for panelists. So with that in mind, many of you are very familiar with Zoom at this point, but we'll be using the Q&A function, which is at the bottom of your screen. And you can ask questions there that are specific to panelists or just generally, and we'll facilitate that behind the scenes. You can also use the chat function, which many of you are doing already, to share information with us and with each other. And then following the webinar, we will send out a recording of today. We'll send out the report. We'll send out a blog around some of the key topics that came up in the discussion, as well as a compilation of the resources that have been mentioned. So to kick us off and to get us started, I'd like to ask Jessica to launch a poll. So we have a few surprising numbers, and we're just going to take a look at where we are in the room versus where Canadians are. So just take a look here. So the first one is, what percentage of Canadians think clean energy will be important to Canada's economy in 10 years? So I invite participants to start voting on that. In the second question is, in the past year, the number of Canadians very concerned about climate change has gone up, gone down, or stayed the same. And support for expanding Canada's oil and gas sector has gone up or gone down, or yeah. So I'll give you a couple of minutes to take a look at that and to choose your answers, and then we'll take a look at where we are versus where Canadians are. All right. Good. All right. Okay. So where did we land? On question number 1, what percentage of Canadians think clean energy will be important to Canada's economy in the next 10 years? So looks like about 30% of you guessed right. So in fact, 92% of Canadians think clean energy will be important to Canada's economy in the next 10 years. So that's interesting. For question number 2, in the past year, the number of Canadians very concerned about climate change has, oh, look at that. Only 6% of you guessed correctly. So in fact, the number of Canadians that are very concerned has gone down. And Chris will get more into that in his presentation. And then finally, support for expanding Canada's oil and gas sector has, let's see here. Yeah, about 15% of you guessed correctly. So support for expanding Canada's oil and gas sector has actually gone up. So thank you. And I will now hand it over to Chris. I'll invite Cara to share her screen and we'll jump into the presentation. Chris, over to you.
Thanks, Amber. Sound good?
Sounds great.
Okay. So what we do is we look at a whole ton of polling that's publicly available and other stuff that we can purchase and just try to distill it all for you and pull out some of the sort of broad trends and big findings. So we're not going to dive into really quantitative stuff about specific numbers and crosstabs and that kind of polling business some of you may be familiar with. Similarly, I'm going to assume that most of you are pretty familiar with the demographic breakdowns, the value systems that drive climate concern and action, differences in regions, and that kind of thing. If you're not, our previous reports and the report you'll get go into much more detail on last year, we looked at efficacy, for example. Do people think they can make a difference? Do people think we as a society can make a difference? And what we call the movable middle, that somewhere around half of the public that are only slightly engaged mentally on the issue and can be moved one way or the other. So those previous reports are available and you'll be getting this year's shortly after the webinar. Let's start first with some good news, Cara. Concern is high. In some polls, even higher than what we're showing here. And you'll notice especially, that bottom bar is quite interesting. Climate change is an emergency that must be stopped no matter the cost. Just over half the public say no matter the cost. And it's notable, this is coming from Ipsos, it is not a pollster that is sort of consistently finding climate cheerleading results. Quote from the chair of Abacus Data here speaks to the fact that the Canadian public generally is gelling around a vision of an energy transition, generally in very high numbers, well over 2/3, now think an energy transition is inevitable, that we're moving towards a clean energy future. Next one. And this is largely driven, of course, by extreme weather events. People have really begun to take on board the fact that fires and floods and heat domes and all the rest of it are getting worse, and that it's a function of climate change. So we'll stay here just for a second. Just for a sec. What we want to draw out of these good news findings is that it's better news, generally speaking, than most Canadians actually realize. So there's this weird dynamic around climate change that I'm sure you're all familiar with. Some people call it climate silence, where we all assume we're more concerned than everyone else, most other people out there. And that's not actually the fact. The fact is we're working from a position of strength. There's no need to be communicating from a sense of embattlement. And it's really still important anytime you have a chance to give these descriptive norms. The what researchers often call second order norms, what we think other people think. Because we're such social beings, it's really important that people understand that 3/4, 80% of the public are on side and think climate change is a really serious problem, and they also are very worried. But we do have blind spots, I think, in terms of our communication. And here's one of them. Is the Earth getting warmer because of human activity? As you see, a majority say yes, but it's only a bare majority. And as you on this call probably know, scientists will tell you that actually we are more than 100% responsible for climate change as human activity. That the Earth actually would be probably slightly cooling if it weren't for us. So the public is not totally gelled around the fact that it's us. Let's go to the next one. There is also, you know, I think we sometimes assume a little too much that we do all think the same. And in fact, we're a very pluralistic society on these issues. The difference between people who self-identify as left-leaning and people who self-identify as right-leaning is enormous. In fact, almost double. Climate change is a major threat. If you're centrist or political left, overwhelmingly, yes, a major threat. If you identify on the political right, not quite even half. And let's go to the next one too. Similarly, people are very concerned about climate change. And if you ask them, should the government be doing more? We get over 2/3, 72% say the government should be doing more or somewhat more to address climate change. But if we stress test that question and put it inside the bundle of everything that government has to be taking care of, we get results that are much more mixed. So about 1/3 of the public think the feds at the moment are about as focused as they ought to be. And about 1/3 say they're not focused enough, but only 1/3. 1/4, as you see, think they're focused too much. So I think, you know, we just wanted to identify some of these potential blind spots in our communication. And I think the basic recommendation here and finding is that we don't have clear line of sight yet. The public doesn't have clear line of sight yet on what exactly the problem is and what its dynamics are, or on the solutions. So it's really important whenever you can to identify and stress agency, like who is responsible for causing climate change and what is responsible for causing climate change, right down to the most basic level that it's humans burning fossil fuels. It's us, particularly industrialized societies, and it's fossil fuels, and spell that out. It's oil and gas and coal. And we will move some of these demand for action and other numbers along. So that's a bit of a snapshot. Here, we're going to look briefly at some of the trends, some of which we looked at in the polling. There has, since 2020, actually been an increase in support for growth in the oil and gas sector. It's not an enormous increase, about 6%, but it's certainly not a decrease. And similarly, an increase that the oil and gas is going to be important to Canada's future, the future of the economy. That is in parallel to the public's belief that clean energy will be very important to Canada's future economy. Both things are increasing basically at the same time. We have seen in the last year or so a decrease in the core segment that is very concerned about climate change. Overall, concern is about the same, but it's shrunk in that one segment and expanded in the segment of people that are somewhat concerned. That's probably a function of all the inflation, cost of living, invasion of Ukraine, all of these things. Psychologists talk about we have a finite pool of worry. You know, when there's tons of problems, there's only room for so many. But, and perhaps paradoxically, there has been an increase in the last year, couple years, in the belief that governments should be doing more to address climate change. And then bottom right, you see steady but overwhelming support for growth in clean power, particularly in renewable energy. It's steady. We show it as a flat line. In part, that's because it is at such a high level. It doesn't have much room to grow outside of right-leaning Canadians. So those are some of the trends that we're seeing over the last, especially the last 2-3 years since 2020. As you'll see, some of them are in conflict with each other. We contain multitudes. Let's keep moving. So specifically on the energy transition, this is one finding that's just super interesting and I think says a lot about where we're at as a public. The importance of oil and gas and the importance of clean energy for Canada's future are both on the rise over the last few years, and by about the same amount, which is pretty fascinating. So this is, I think, one of the basic dynamics we're dealing with as communicators. Go on to the next. That said, what you can see here, this is support for expanding actually different types of energy. Solar panels, you know, massively popular, same for wind, nuclear over half, and that's actually also been on the rise for over the last few years. Really interesting, I think, how little support coal mining has, and that probably speaks to the controversy not long ago in Alberta, where, you know, we had country music stars and everyone else coming out in opposition to coal mining right in fossil fuel country. Another interesting one here is how unpopular fracking is, hydraulic fracturing. Less than a third of Canadians support natural gas development if it's framed as fracking. So keep an eye on that 50% that support expanding oil and gas operations as we move to the next slide. Very interesting that natural gas is way, way more popular than oil. And I think this speaks to a number of things. One is, you know, industry propaganda, and another is simply the branding that there's been around natural gas and the emphasis that's been put on it lately. But much more, like, you know, when you talk about just oil and gas the way we normally talk about it, and you saw the numbers we were looking at previously, when the communication turns to natural gas, it's important to understand that the Canadian public is actually very receptive to expanding natural gas production. Let's keep going. So one of the big arguments you'll be running into as communicators, I'm sure, is industry's arguments around producing more oil and gas and doing so either to help with global energy security or even to combat climate change outright. That because we are safe, secure, ethical supplier, we can displace coal, we can displace fossil fuels from less savory sources. And what you find here is that the numbers have not changed much over the last 2-3 years or so, but Canadians are, you need to know, very receptive currently to the argument that our exports will actually help combat climate change globally. This slide is looking specifically at combating climate change. If you ask the question, we should expand our oil and gas exports to address energy security globally, you get about the kind of the same results. Let's keep going. And here we switch from fossil fuels to clean energy, and specifically some policies that are on the table. And what you see is that there is broad support for a lot of the clean energy policies that are on the table. Electric vehicles have very much become a symbol for people of this energy transition. 80% now of Canadians now think that electric vehicles are going to take over from internal combustion engines. But a couple of important points as we're looking through this slide. One is that 3/4 of Canadians support government encouraging clean energy, or say incentives to choose electric vehicles. If you look at that one, 3/4. But if the question shifts to, should the government step in and start imposing penalties on manufacturers or forcing them to sell electric vehicles and to phase down internal combustion vehicles, support drops really dramatically. Suddenly we're just over half of people. So, it all speaks to this kind of line of sight question and agency question that we highlighted right up at the start. People need a more clear understanding that it's fossil fuels that are driving climate change, and that fossil fuels need to go away in order to satisfy their concern about global warming. Let's keep moving. And this is the final sort of data slide. Very interesting research by Eric LaChapelle and Eco-Analytics, who looked at a bunch of the important kind of conversations that are going on in climate world, and tried to get at people's literacy and understanding of what's true and not true. So what you want to be looking at here is the dark green segment, which is people that are, pretty convinced of a particular statement, and the very light green segment, which is people that just don't know what to think. So, for example, less than 1/4 of the public think are convinced that oil companies have been hiding evidence of climate change since the 70s, whereas I suspect everyone on this call understands that they have. Only 18% are convinced that Canadian doctors believe climate change is a public health emergency, although, of course, not just Canadian doctors, but the health field internationally very much thinks it is. Bottom of the left-hand column is a very interesting one too. You cannot power an industrial economy with renewable energy alone. 1/3 of Canadians simply don't know what to think on this question. And those don't know what to think numbers are both very high, and speak to the kind of movable middle that we all need to address in our communications, and also an enormous problem as the sort of controversy over climate change has shifted from denial of the facts of climate change to what some call predatory delay. So trying to undermine the validity of solutions. That 1/3 to 1/2 of the public that doesn't know what to think provides fertile ground for misinformation. So, for example, this was really shocking to me. Bottom of the right-hand column, fully half of Canadians are not sure whether solar panels emit more greenhouse gases during their manufacturing than they end up saving. And when we've been doing focus groups recently, we are hearing memes like that coming back at us pretty consistently and surprisingly commonly. People are people think that batteries, for example, are hugely destructive. They're not sure that solar panels are actually worth all the effort. Questions like this, the predatory delay is definitely being effective at seeping in, and it's something we as communicators and practitioners are really going to need to get a handle on. Last slide, please. Which is Eric's point here. I'm not sure if Eric has made it onto the call, but that was his research looking at confusion and misinformation. Those large segments of people who just don't know what to think are a serious vulnerability for a social mandate for any kind of aggressive action. So that is my run through of some of the really high-level findings in the report. I'm going to hand over now to Valériane.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Chris. So what I quickly want to present to you are the results of the 2022 edition of the Baromètre de l'Action Climatique, which is a study that we conduct every year in the province of Quebec with a representative sample of 2,000 adult Quebecers. And so, as you will see, many key findings are similar to what Chris just presented to you regarding the Canadian population in general. Next slide, please. So the first finding is that there is a huge consensus on the need to act. Next. In 2022, 86% of the population believed in the urgency of tackling climate change in Quebec, which is the highest level that we have observed so far. So the concern is very high. And as a result, as you can see, there's a strong desire for climate action. As you can see, the Quebecers are particularly willing to see changes coming from industries and businesses in the left bar, the 84% bar, as well as federal and provincial governments. And they also want citizens to dive in the climate action, as well as cities and municipalities. However, despite this strong feeling of urgency, there is still resistance to strong changes in the daily lives of Quebecers. Yes, next slide, please. Yes, 85% of Quebecers report acting already on climate change. And yes, 66% of them declare wanting to do more. And this is all good news, obviously, but the most effective behaviors to reduce the population carbon footprint are slow to be adopted. And here I'm thinking about reducing meat consumption, reducing car use, composting. So there's still improvement to be made. The third finding is that climate change is still a distant problem for Quebecers. On the next slide, you can see with the dark green bars that Quebecers are less likely to perceive a high immediate threat to themselves, instead believing that the threat is more significant for the province, the country, or the rest of the world. And obviously, this is something that communicators will have to address. And despite this personal distance, interestingly, Quebecers show a high level of solidarity with the most vulnerable groups. And indeed, in 2022, next slide, please. 85% of them were thinking that it is important to take measures to protect those who are the most likely to suffer from climate change. And again, this is good news since climate justice is an issue. However, the downside is that people are still struggling with identifying who are the most vulnerable groups. And for example, in our survey, people hardly see that women, indigenous peoples, or children were among the most at risk with climate change. A fifth finding in our study is that we saw in 2002 a slight increase in beliefs that may harm climate action. And here I'm thinking about the next slide. Feeling of powerlessness, blame shifting, denial of human responsibility, and strong techno-optimism. And why is it happening? Why do we see an increase in those harmful beliefs? Obviously, there are many explanations, but one of the strongest hypothesis is that the way that the climate crisis appears in the Quebec media has changed a lot since the COVID pandemic. And I'm part of a research team with Eric Lachapelle, among all, that found that during the first 2 years following March 2020, climate change has been less mentioned in Quebec media. And when it was done with a more pessimistic tone. So the focus was more on the bad news, the problems, instead of the solution. So obviously it can explain, it's an hypothesis why we see all those beliefs growing up. And again, this is something that communicators will have to address. And finally, a last important finding is that eco-anxiety is becoming a public health issue, at least in the province of Quebec, but I'm pretty sure this is not only the case in Quebec. And this is something that we as communicators have to take into account when we are planning our communication strategies. And indeed, almost half of the Quebec population in 2022 reported feeling eco-anxiety in the past year. And really, this is a lot, half of the population. And according to a study led by my colleague, Mélissa Généreux, which is on the next slide. Thank you very much. In 2022, the mental health of the population is probably going to be more and more affected by the climate crisis, since there's a correlation between the fact of being exposed to extreme weather events and reporting anxiety, severe depression, or eco-anxiety symptoms. And we, as communicators, need first to know that fact and be careful when we talk to these people dealing with mental health issues, because eco-anxiety can either be a driver for climate action or, at the opposite, paralyzes climate action. So that's it for a very really quick overview of our results, and I will be happy to jump in the panel discussion.
Thank you, Valériane. Thank you very much. So the next section, that was a lot of information. So the next part of the webinar is really an opportunity for us to talk to the presenters, and we'll be joined by Cara Pike to make sense of, well, what does this all mean? What's standing out for them? What would be the big signals that are breaking through for them, and what kind of advice might they offer for communicators? I just want to say there were a couple of questions in the chat. Yes, we will be sharing this recording. We'll be sharing a report and a summary of the discussion afterwards. And also, if you have questions, please pop them into the Q&A, and you can also upvote if you have a similar question that's already been asked. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Cara, who's going to kick us off. And Cara, the question that came through both kind of, you can see it in the chat and here, and also that came through when people were registering, was really around how do communicators use these insights to energize the concerned or the base, but also to reach the movable middle? And what do we need to be thinking about, and why? So over to you, Cara.
Okay, great. Thanks, Amber. And thanks everyone for joining today. Thanks for the presentations. You can get more guidance in the report itself, but also in a messaging playbook that we produced and released last year, and we can put the link to that into the chat. But in essence, regardless of the audience, we really want to be thinking about including a clear challenge, a clear choice, and an opportunity. And the challenge is really what is creating that tension and making us act, that barrier we have to overcome. And you have your heroes in your story, the protagonist moving through to address that challenge. And then ultimately the choice is what can be done. And in this context, it's really, what are the actions we can take now about climate change? What are people's role in that? Really clarifying what is it that people can do to contribute, particularly when you think of those findings just presented of people really feeling they do have a role to play. And then the opportunity is around what will be better when we take action. And I think this formula, if you can see, it's sort of 1/3 the threat, but then 2/3 really tipping to the positive. And I think that's important in terms of addressing that kind of eco-anxiety that was just referenced. And you also don't have to lead with the challenge. You can lead with that opportunity, the sort of where we, the benefits, that vision of what gets better when we take action. So those are some choices we have. I think when it comes to the most eco concern, we can lead with the challenge, and we can make that very much climate change with fossil fuels driving it. You can be fairly direct about that. And I think, though, if we're trying to get out beyond those most concerned, you may have to really lean into other issues that are really predominant in people's minds and link it to climate change. So, leaning into that extreme weather threat that people are experiencing, seeing in their own lives, communities across the country, and the cost of inaction, the rising costs of dealing with that, and the cost of inaction if we don't actually address it. That can work quite well. But again, really taking the opportunity to link the fact that it's fossil fuels really driving this, climate change driving this. And that was one of the findings that popped out for me, is just the lack of clarity people have when they experience the extreme weather events, the degree to which climate change is driving that. It can also be framed from an economic lost opportunity perspective with the challenge that if this inevitable transition is underway and Canada doesn't want to be left behind. So those are just some thoughts about what it is, in terms of tailoring that for different audiences. I think the opportunity, those benefits really need to be tangible for people around affordability, around security, safety, but also don't underrate that people actually want to feel like they're contributing and that we are leading. And so there is an opportunity for Canada to do the right thing, for communities to do the right thing, for individuals to do the right thing on this issue. In thinking about this from the perspective of some of the different types of folks who are joining the webinar today, I think governments at all levels have a major responsibility to address the literacy issues that were referenced, the lack of clarity of what's really at the root of extreme weather, that fossil fuels are driving climate change, but also that pathway of what it is that we need to do in order to take on this challenge is very murky for people, and not to push it too far out into the future. What are the things that can be done right now? For advocates, really leaning into look at ways to take away the social license for the fossil fuel industry. And some of the findings in the report show, there's pretty high levels of support for things like carbon capture and storage. So trying to capture emissions from our oil and gas production, but So you can really see the effect of some of the industry advertising campaigns and whatnot in getting people to think that, because really we know, and the data is quite clear, the science is quite clear, there's no way to address the climate challenge by relying on those technologies, which are largely unproven and not proven at scale. That there's no way of getting to the root of moving away from oil and gas. So I think that's really important. One of the things I thought was really interesting was just the inevitability of this transition. And I think that's something to really lean into. And about a decade ago, I was doing work for a number of advocates trying to stop expansion of pipelines. And then the discourse and public opinion was very much locked into the inevitability of fossil fuels expanding, and that being the way we were going to nation build and whatnot. So I think it's actually very exciting and interesting that the inevitability frame has tipped. People have been working hard on that. And really leaning into, it is inevitable that we are moving away from oil and gas. So where does Canada want to be on that pathway, given that's where we're going? So yes, a few thoughts. And again, there's more tips in that playbook that you can refer to.
Thanks, Cara. Okay, so Valériane, again, we had a number of questions that came through from people when they were registering. And one of them really, people were asking a lot about, well, what are the drivers? How can we drive change, or what are the barriers we need to overcome? And the work that you've been researching and presenting in Quebec really is you're kind of leading on a number of those issues. And so I'm curious, from your perspective, or for the work that you've been doing, what have been the key drivers in changing in Quebec from your perspective? What have been the biggest barriers from your understanding, and kind of what can we learn from Quebec?
Thank you for the questions. First of all, maybe some could think that Quebec is leading the country regarding climate action. However, well, first of all, this is not my research field to compare Quebec with the rest of Canada. And I think also that many observers from academics to citizens and NGOs could argue that we have still a lot to do. Quebecers are heavy buyers of SUVs. We are among the biggest consumer energy in the world. However, as you said, I've been closely analyzing the Quebec population since the last 4 years or so, and I can highlight two key drivers that make me think that we have a huge potential to become stronger leaders in climate action. And first of all, there's an important civil mobilization in the province of Quebec, coming from all groups of society: students, parents, artists, business leaders, NGOs. And these groups are not only revendicating changes, but they are proposing concrete, tangible solutions, ranging from how to build greener cities, how to adopt eco-fiscality, etc. And by doing so, they show that climate is important and that more and more people are concerned and are acting to protect it. So relying on different messengers and spreading the message like this is increasing our confidence in our ability to tackle the climate crisis. And the second driver, the second point, is that even though Quebecers are full of paradoxes, as I said, they show a strong solidarity with the most vulnerable groups, as I said earlier. And despite the fact that they do not feel personally threatened by the climate crisis, they know that other people are, even though they do not know who they are, but they know that other people are, and they care. And I think that by using storytelling and strong images, we can increase population's willingness to protect the most vulnerable, just as we did during the pandemic. So that are the key drivers, but just as Cara said also, I think that one of the biggest barriers to strong climate action is still the misunderstanding of the choices that need to be made here and now. We need to go beyond small steps. We need to adopt strong public policies, and we need the public support, but this support won't come if people do not understand the pathway. And I think that, well, climate literacy, just as Cara said, is one of the most challenging thing that we have to address as communicators.
Right. Well, I mean, Chris, you've pulled through probably hundreds and hundreds of polls by this point over the last 3 years. Do you have a sense of where the gaps are in public understanding, both, I guess, for themselves, but also expectations of government, and what we, are there specific policies, are there specific things that consistently are gaps in our understanding?
Yeah, well, I think that probably the most important and the one we can make the most difference on, the kind of folks that are on this call, is around painting a clearer picture of the pathway forward. And, you know, like we were talking about, people don't have a really gelled understanding that the underlying problem is fossil fuels, oil, gas, and coal. And so, you know, when someone starts talking about, oh, you're going to need to replace your gas boiler, you know, the same person who's highly concerned about climate change and worried about their kids doesn't sort of make the connection to, oh, yeah, I guess we all need to get off gas in our homes and buildings. So I would say, you know, it's continuing to emphasize the agency, that it's human activity and it's fossil fuels, oil, gas, and coal. And then painting, you know, the inevitable click for people then is, oh, we got to get off oil, gas, and coal. And we paint the picture for them of how we do that. And at its very simplest level, because I think that's what's super important, especially for the movable middle, it's electrify everything. We build clean energy, and our vehicles, our buildings, factories, everything that can be electrified gets electrified using clean energy. And it's almost like too simple for the kind of people that are on the call, I realize, but it's exactly the level of comprehension that we don't yet have with the public. And in some ways, it's all they need to understand. If we can get to the point where everyone is hyper clear that we got to get off fossil fuels and we got to get onto clean electricity, then the policy measures and the more sort of, you know, detailed wonky stuff that comes down the pipe all makes sense in that rubric. So we got to talk a lot more about electrify everything.
Great. Well, I mean, just building on that, and this, I'd like to put it out to all the panelists. One of the questions that came up in advance was really around how much is too much information? How much is too much information when it comes to the realities of what we're facing, or these intricacies of policy? So Chris, you've kind of touched on that. Keep it super simple. Get off fossil fuels, electrify everything. Cara, I'm curious from your experience or your perspective, how much is too much information? And you know, what's the right note when it comes to addressing this?
Well, I think one piece is around the type of language we're using. So if we're relying on kind of wonky terms, like even net zero, and not explaining what we mean by that, I think we start to lose people. And so it's also just about that plain, straightforward, relatable language. And then I do think it's about that balance between, you know, sure, draw attention to the problem. We need that to create tension, but don't leave people hanging there, that you have to include those other pieces. You know, I think we often make it a bit of a full-time job for people to try and figure out, what is this issue about? What is government doing? How do I play a role? So a lot of times when we're working with governments and local governments in particular, it's about like all of the various things that are being done, can you get it down into like four buckets, right? Like, and then pull together different actions to make it easy for people. Yeah, and just the relatability. I think as much as it is the type of language, though, and that balance, we also know the messenger is really critical, and that people really respond when messengers don't stay in their lane of expertise, right? So we want and need more health professionals out there talking about health risks related to extreme weather, related to gas in the home, etc. But we need people who are experts in economics, finance, to be talking about the economic side of the energy transition. And we need the climate environmental voices to be doing that clear accountability messaging and watchdogging government and business. So I think in part it's, we know the messenger is so critical, and particularly in social media where, people really get a lot of information and are influenced by others.
Great. Valériane, anything that you would add on this, this point around how much is too much?
Yes, this question about information overload is a very good question. And I talked earlier about my colleague, Melissa Généreux, who did a study about mental health. And in her study, she measured a concept called climate fatigue, which one of its dimensions is being tired of hearing about climate change all the time. And the results showed in 2021 that 1/3 of Quebecers were experiencing climate fatigue. So information overload. And the problem is that this type of climate fatigue is not only associated with more mental issues like anxiety or depression symptoms, but also with demotivation to dive in climate action and demotivation to be informed about climate change. So I think that we just, as Cara said, think about how we want to talk about climate change. We have to frame it the right way for the right person using the right messengers.
Okay, well, a note on that, there were a couple of questions that came through on trust and who is trusted. Cara, you've said, people are most trusted if they stay in their lane. But this question that you had raised, or I guess the information that you had presented, Chris, around mistrust and building mistrust or disinformation, et cetera. I'm just curious if you have any advice for communicators around dealing with that. Specifically, we've got a question here from Ryan Smith around untrustworthy communicators. Sorry. I'm going to get to your question after this. We're going to stay on topic here. Chris, you had kind of raised this piece around misinformation, or this kind of third of Canadians that don't really know what to think. Do you have any advice or whatnot that you would offer at this point around what communicators can do?
Yeah, well, it's, one way at it is to think about it in your own life and where you trust, where you get your information and where it sinks in. And the unfortunate truth is that is often kind of friends, family, like your kind of social orbit. So that is purely a function, I think, of climate communication volume. So you're seeping in, and there's not a ton we can do about it other than, amplifying social media campaigns and those kind of things. In terms of trusted messengers specifically, the news is not good in the sense that we're in an age of populism and declining trust almost across the board, especially around experts, right? And politicians. And if you look at the polling data on what people's self-reported trust in various institutions and various messengers, it's all downward arrows pretty much, except for two, and those are scientists and doctors, which you might not expect given all the controversy around COVID and mandates and all that. But actually those two, medical professionals second, scientists top, maintain really phenomenal levels of trust in the Canadian public. And it's an advantage we have over a lot of other countries actually, where those two took a big hit in the last couple of years. Also, university academics in their field of expertise retain high levels of trust. But all you really need to do is either look at amplifying messengers, scientists and doctors, where you can, or simply put it into your framing, that scientists say, scientists agree. Mm-hmm. There's super interesting research. I don't think it's been done in Canada, but it has been in the United States, where they look at whether people believe that there's a scientific consensus around climate or a scientific consensus around the pathway forward. And as you all on the call know, there is, almost unheard of scientific consensus on these questions. But the public doesn't know it. It's more like, 99% of scientists are in consensus, only half the public realizes that to be the case. And when you move that number, so what the more the public understands that there is scientific consensus, it opens up engagement and literacy on all the other issues. So, I would continue to stress scientists and health professionals whenever possible. In addition, of course, to the usual kind of recommendations around messengers appropriate to audience and that kind of thing.
Great. Anything, Cara or Valériane, that you'd like to add to that before we move into participant questions?
Yeah, I think it's important to recognize just the scale of the funding behind the misinformation. And when you have groups like Pathways Alliance out doing paid media about, how oil and gas is so Canadian during hockey night in Canada, it's like, no wonder people are confused, and they're not the only group doing that. So I think in addition to what I mentioned earlier about real focus on campaigns that really start to take apart the social license for that industry, we need marketing campaigns that really talk about the pathway and the benefits and how to get involved in really plain language. And, I think that civil society can play a role in that, but ultimately, in order for it to be on scale, we really need government to be operating that way. And I have been actually quite pleased with the ads that the province of BC has been running around heat pumps now that there are, clear incentive programs. And it's just framed in a really approachable way that connects back to, again, what people care about, and those tying things to multiple benefits. So it's about saving money. And now that we have these more extreme heat events that we didn't used to, being able to stay cool in the summer and things that just, allow people to see themselves where they are in this pathway and how to get involved. So I think it's really important that we start to normalize that we're on this pathway, we're in this transition, and there will be benefits for people. And I think back to the point that Valériane made, for those most impacted from climate change as well.
Mm-hmm. Valériane, anything you'd add before we move into just
a small comment. My advice maybe would be surprising, but I would suggest to all participants today to not hesitate to establish partnerships with marketing professionals. If marketers or publicists are able to sell to citizens SUV that most of them do not need, they are able to sell new dreams, new lifestyles that we need. We have to transition from a message which is climate action equals sacrifice to transitioning to new lifestyle will be better for you, for your life, for your children, for your community. And marketers are professional dream sellers. So do not hesitate to partner with marketers.
Thank you. Okay. We need people to sell us the dreams of better lives. I'm here for it. A question that came in from Christine Beavis-Trickett, and I think that there were some questions that came in advance just around specific things like hydrogen or geothermal and different kind of solutions. So what she's asking is about what's the role of nature-based solutions in climate change. So she knows that there's been some research done on Canadians' understanding of the concept. Has anything further been done in terms of their understanding of it as a pathway? Would one of you like to talk about kind of where Canadians are at on nature-based solutions? Chris?
Well, I can say that what the research shows is that nature-based solutions are wildly popular. I mean, even more than, solar, which is up in the mid 80% of popularity. So it's really the most popular potential policy that's sort of put out there on the table, which is almost certainly why you see the federal government advertising around nature-based solutions. And it's also not at all controversial. You don't typically run into conflicts with incumbent industries. Kids can go out and plant trees. It's sort of all good news. And so that's great for groups that are wanting to protect nature, restore nature, and use climate as an argument. You've got the wind at your back on that front. I worry that it's not great for actually tackling climate change, because we can plant all the trees we want and we can restore all the natural areas that we can. And if we don't address the 80% of the problem coming from fossil fuels, we've sort of missed the point. And I do worry that, especially when I see the ads from the feds running on TV, it's the obvious tendency is to go take the easy path, right, or the non-controversial path. And I think what we need to be doing as climate advocates and communicators is keeping the focus on the production and burning of fossil fuels and the need to electrify everything.
Okay, thank you.
Right.
This might go to you, Chris, but then I think we'll open it up to the other panelists as well. There were a couple questions around regional differences, specifically on these kind of big indicators. Curious, Chris, if there's anything that you would mention related to big differences regionally.
Yeah, well, I mean, the big differences are what you probably would expect, so that Quebec is sort of the most climate aware, climate mobilized population in the country. Saskatchewan the least, and Alberta sort of second least. And it's entirely correlated to economics in some ways. Where you have a big oil and gas industry and the public is invested in it. And, the big hockey rivalry is the Oilers against the Flames. Obviously a lot more conflict. Quebec is sort of actually, I think in some ways, an interesting case because it is culturally and in so many ways distinct, to borrow a term. but you see it also, British Columbia and Alberta right next to each other. British Columbia, huge hydro resources, not an enormous reliance historically on oil and gas. Climate policy much less controversial. In BC, we've had a carbon tax now for well over a decade, and it is supported by both political parties. So, yeah, the only other thing I would add is that the media accentuates these things in a way that's not super helpful. So the Albertans actually have, in some ways, the most energy literacy in the country. They understand the issues better than most. And there is much more support for climate policy in Alberta than the politics or the kind of political media would suggest. The numbers that you get out of Alberta are, really shocking. And we all saw when Greta Thunberg, showed up pre-pandemic and just drew that enormous crowd. Like, there is a latent desire in Alberta, just like everywhere, to grapple with the issue.
I remember that visual really well. Valériane, there were a couple questions around just specific segments, and I'm wondering, from your research and somebody who's very familiar with the crosstabs, are there particular segments or demographics or people who are advancing more rapidly in their support for climate action, or their demand for climate action?
That's what we are looking for when we looked at our data. And we have to be careful when looking at the demographic variables or segments like age or gender or level of education. These are not the best segments to divide the population. It is most effective to use a psychographic segmentation, grouping people with their attitudes, beliefs, behaviors. So there's no demographics or group advancing more rapidly. Or maybe we can say that, surprisingly, the oldest group, I don't want to do ageism here, but maybe the 55 and more in Quebec are particularly active regarding climate action, which is surprising. Youth are concerned. Youth want more from governments, from every actors in the society, but the one doing the more action are the oldest person in Quebec. But again, psychographic segmentation is more effective when trying to find the right audiences to talk to.
Okay, thank you. Well, we are running out of time. There's so many questions that we did not answer, but please rest assured that we will take a look at those and help. They'll help inform both what we share afterwards, but also our work moving forward. There was one question that I don't want to leave off the table before we leave, and Cara, I'll turn to you to kick us off, but I'd love to hear from each one of the panelists. We are coming into an election, and Chris had shared the slide around the divisions around the political right and the political left. Any one thought that you might share for the folks on this call around what the research says in terms of how communicators should be preparing for that? Cara, I'll start with you, and then Chris, and then Valériane.
I guess part of it is just leaning into some of the advice shared earlier around, just repeating that the public is in and wants action. And that's really the one of the key bars for deciding. And I think we saw that in the last federal election. Climate was a very big factor in how people voted. And I think it comes back to pushing on who's really going to get to the source of the problem, which is our situation with oil and gas, not just emissions from the current production we have, but our plans for expansion, which are pretty significant and would really take the world in a different direction than most Canadians understand our role to be on this. So yeah, I think we need to clarify that the bar for climate leadership is a willingness to move us away from oil and gas and onto the clean, abundant renewable energy sources and other low carbon solutions out there. Great.
Chris, quick thought?
Yeah, well, so we'll see what happens as we get closer to the moment. But what really strikes me is that you know, the Conservatives are need to get all kinds of scrutiny on not having a decent climate plan. That's a big lift, obviously, as you saw from that slide. But you know, the countries that are doing really well have a much stronger cross-party consensus than what we have in North America. Dropping all pretense of everything, what I would also say is that the Liberals are generally running ahead of public opinion. Like they're doing more than they need to do to keep the public satisfied. And the NDP, for reasons that I do not understand, aren't being the ones with the whip. And so I might really go at the NDP to come up with something that puts pressure on the Liberals, because the Liberals, as it stands on climate, I think can coast.
Okay, thank you. Valériane, last thought to you, and then we'll close.
Good, so last and quick, I think that when preparing for the next elections, we have to get citizens to be both lucid and optimistic. Lucid because climate change is happening here and now. They have to understand that, and be still optimistic because we can do things. There's a pathway to climate action, and they have to think about that when they will be thinking of who they will vote to. So optimistic lucidity, I think that's the key.
Thank you very much. Okay, well, thank you to our panelists. Thank you to the rich and active chat and the people who showed up. Also, thank you to two of the people who helped Chris this year on the report. That includes Maria Granados and Rama Aldaka. Sorry for your work, and also to the reviewers this year, which included Louise Comeau, Mana Dupuis, Kate Mahone, and our own Dr. Chris Russell with Re.Climate, and our colleagues at Climat who helped to bring Valériane and the insights through and include them in the report. So for those of you who are not aware, we work closely with our colleagues in Quebec, and we encourage you to check out the community of practice for communicators in Quebec, and we'll pop into the link there. Yeah, so you can either connect with them directly, or you can visit the website. They too offer research and training reports and really do a lot to support climate communicators. Again, we will share the recording, we'll share a report, we'll share some insights that we've synthesized from this. The other thing that I wanted to just point out is that we have also done a kind of regional analysis in Alberta around engaging average Albertans. And so we'll share that with you. We did a great webinar a couple of months ago on that. And finally, when we close this session, there will be a little survey, and we're always very interested and we depend on your feedback. So if you could take a moment, give us a few quick thoughts. It'll take you less than a minute to fill out. So thank you, everybody. Thank you for showing up, and good work and bonne chance in the work that you're doing. Keep it up. Thank you.